Is the term and the concept of fascism, right? We hear about fascism a lot. Fascism is becoming this sort of all-encompassing, the end-all, be-all word that is being used to smear and sully people who are opposed to the agenda of the modern left. Right? Whenever the left and its many machinations cannot get their way, it does not seem as though they are getting their way. Everything to them is always a threat to our democracy, right? And I can hear you all saying it now. Of course, the United States is not a democracy. Of course, this is a representative republic, right? You know, we all know that. I don't think. Well, you know, many supporters of the Democrat Party, I'm not too sure that they understand that today. Right. So fascism, right? Fascism is this boogeyman. It's one of those words. And that's why I titled this Fascism, America's Boogeyman. Textbook encyclopedia definition of fascism. Fascism is a political ideology and mass movement that dominated many parts of Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe between 1919 and 1945, and that also had its inherence in Western Europe, the United States, South Africa, Japan, Latin America, and the Middle East. Europe's first fascist leader was none other than, of course, Benito Mussolini. He took the name of his party from the Latin word fascis, which referred to a bundle of elm or branch rods, usually containing an axe. This as the symbol for the penal authority in ancient Rome. Because what you're going to discover is that fascism and communism, in fact, are separate delineations that originate from the same seed. Fascism is the political attitude that places the nation or race at the center of life and history and disregards individuals and their rights. So ask yourself this question. Now, when you hear Democrats and their sycophants and their public relations agents in the media calling those on the other side fascists, ask yourself this question. Is that what American conservatism stands for? It sounds eerily similar to a lot of the things that we've been talking about already with respect to communism and Marxism. They sound the same. Who, in fact, was the father of fascism? Now, remember that Mussolini was the first fascist leader of Europe, and he wrote a doctrine or what became known as the doctrine of fascism. Benito Mussolini, who of course was the inspiration or one of Adolf Hitler's primary inspirations, was Benito Mussolini. But the man who co-wrote, and perhaps wrote more of the doctrine of fascism than Benito Mussolini himself was an Italian philosopher by the name of Giovanni Gentile. Giovanni Gentile. He was an Italian neo-Hegelian idealist, philosopher, educator, and fascist politician. He self-styled himself the philosopher of fascism, and he was influential in providing an intellectual foundation for Italian fascism, and he ghostwrote part of the doctrine of fascism with Benito Mussolini. He was involved in the resurgence of Hegelian idealism in Italian philosophy, and also devised his own system of thought, which he called actual idealism or actualism, which has been described as the subjective extreme of the idealist tradition. So we're going to get more into Giovanni Gentile so we can figure out exactly where the term and the concept of fascism comes from, all right? Now, Giovanni Gentile was born in 1875 in Italy, Castelvetrano, Italy, and he died, of course, on April 15th, 1944 in Florence, Italy, where he was assassinated by anti-fascist communists, right? Now, he was a major figure in Italian philosophy. I just went into that a little bit. But it goes on here, and I'm reading directly from the Encyclopedia Britannica, that his actual idealism is kind of like a thing that he coined, right? A term that a style, a sub-genre of philosophy that he coined after none other than the man I'm about to name here. His actual idealism shows the strong influence of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Giovanni Gentile was one of the key members in the resurgence of Hegelianism in the early 20th century, and this became known as Neo-Hegelianism. But what do we know about Friedrich Hegel, who was in fact the primary intellectual and philosophical influence of Karl Marx? It was Friedrich Hegel. Now, wait a minute. Now, Giovanni Gentile was heavily influenced. This is the father of fascism. He was heavily influenced by Marx. But so was, no, I'm sorry, he was heavily influenced by Hegel, but so was Marx. So wait a minute, Giovanni Gentile and Marx, same seed, Hegel, okay. After a series of university appointments, Gentile in 1917 became professor of the history of philosophy at the University of Rome, while writing a book called The Philosophy of Marx. This is what Gentile wrote. The Philosophy of Marx, a Hegelian examination of Karl Marx's philosophy. He met a man by the name of Benedetto Croce. Now, I started to kind of go into some of the background of Croce, but I decided to just kind of let that fly because I don't want to deal with Croce too much. But he's another figure. But Benedetto Croce would go on later in life to renounce fascism when he saw pretty much the destruction and the havoc it caused all across Europe, and he later went on to denounce it. But Gentile and Croce were pretty much the two co-founders of what became known as fascism in the early 20th century. Now we're gonna get kind of like more into some details dealing with Croce. This is written by a man named Frank Smither, who was born in 1933. Smither writes about Giovanni Gentile. Philosophically, Gentile, he drew from Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Hegel, and Marx, system builders. He had some admiration for Nietzsche and had a romantic view of historic leaders of Italian nationalism. He had been an academic, the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Palermo University from 1907 to 1914. In 1923, he accepted Mussolini's offer to become the Minister of Education. Gentile admired Marx, although with his fellow fascists, he was opposed to class struggle. Their nationalism embodied a unified patriotic devotion to the state. He and fellow fascists viewed Italy as a single organic entity and unifying force that bound people together by their ancestry. Marx viewed, of course, everything was determined by their material sort of lot in life. And of course, this became known as Marx's dialectical materialism, which is what, in fact, drew its inspiration from Hegel's form of dialectics. But Marx just, of course, took it and turned it into something material. So what Croce is saying is that never mind class. Your primary allegiance, of course, belongs to the state and not your class. For us, the nation, now this is Mussolini. For us, the nation is not just territory, but something spiritual. A nation is great when it translates into reality the force of spirit. So Gentile's admiration for Marx can be compared to the youthful Adolf Hitler's admiration of the socialist labor movement marching together in a seemingly endless file through the streets of Vienna. What Hitler admired was the labor movement's mobilization for the sake of power. What Gentile admired in Marx was the unity of his system of thought, including its historicity. How is it that when we think about socialism, we think about Marx? We think about Marx, we think about leftism. But when we think about the Socialist Labor Party of Germany, aka the National Socialists, i.e. the Nazis, we think about far-right authoritarianism, but the name socialism is directly in the title. Why and where did the beef and the disconnect between Adolf Hitler and Moscow, Joseph Stalin, where did the disconnect come? Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini did not want to take their dictates from Moscow because Adolf Hitler believed that the peoples of Germany were in fact uniquely German. So what you had with the Soviet Union at the time was, of course, the prototype of what we refer to today as the neoliberal globalist world order. But that's what you had, of course, in Moscow. This kind of one-size-fits-all top-down dictatorship with total disregard to how the various peoples and groups of people all over the world viewed themselves as something intrinsically unique and different from, say, for example, the peoples of Russia. So Adolf Hitler and others who were like, well, we get the whole undermining the individual for what is, in fact, in the best interest of the collective, but why should we listen to Russia? Why is Russia like Germany? Why is Russia like Italy? Well, we are going to create this communist utopia. We do, in fact, need to do away with trivial lines of, say, a demarcation and separation like political boundaries. Let's get rid of the very notion, the very concept of the state. But according to the fascists, the state itself is, of course, the moral organism of the society. And so this is where you see the similarities and the connections between fascism and Marxism, because what does Marx say about the role of the state? See, in order for you to eliminate private property, as Marx prophesized, you must force those who do own something to give up what it is that they own. So remember when Marx talked about that there would be a momentary period of despotism where the state would, of course, be tyrannical. This is, of course, the example that we think of when we think about fascism. Fascism is a step toward what Marx would refer to as communism, when, of course, the state would wither away and die, when man would have been effectively transformed into a socialist man, and then you would have an example of this kind of spontaneous outbreak of what became known, or this sort of spontaneous outbreak of what we today refer to as social justice. So you would need a state when mankind, or when human beings would, of course, be successfully rebranded, reprogrammed, and retrained. Among many fascists was a belief that they were acting with a purpose, without which the world would be absurd. Gentile stood against the positivism that limited authentic knowledge to that based on sense experience. Now, this is what Marx was talking about. Marx said that knowledge is based solely on sense experience, i.e. his idea or concept of materialism. But fascist philosophy, claimed Gentile, was not skeptical, nor agnostic, nor pessimistic, nor passively optimistic. Fascism, he claimed, was man engaged in a moral and intellectual struggle in an exercise of free will in the creation of a new world. So if Gentile and Marx drew from Hegel, well, what exactly was Hegelianism? Hegelianism is the collection of philosophical movements that developed out of the thought of the 19th century German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The term here is so construed as to exclude Hegel himself and to include, therefore, only the ensuing Hegelian movements. A history in which it seems, as such, its thought is focused upon history and logic. A history in which it seems in various perspectives that the rational is the real, and a logic in which sees that truth is in the whole. Friedrich Hegel drew inspiration from Hermes Trismegistus, and he came up with the philosophy of Hermeticism. Much of Hegelianism sort of borrows from Hermeticism. It's sort of like Hermeticism repackaged and rebranded as something new, unique, and different, but that's not, in fact, what it is. The Hegelian system, in which German idealism reached its fulfillment, claimed to provide a unitary solution to all of the problems of philosophy. It held that the speculative point of view, which transcends all particular and separate perspectives, must grasp the one truth, bringing back to its proper center all the problems of logic, of metaphysics, and the philosophies of nature, law, history, and culture. According to Hegel, this attitude is more than a formal method that remains extraneous to its own content. Rather, it represents the actual development of the absolute, of the all-embracing totality of reality, considered as subject, not merely as substance. So understand what I just said. So what Hegel is saying in so many words is that when he says that it represents the actual development of the absolute, so the experience of alienation is what in fact develops, or what allows the knowledge of the absolute to develop from its own negation. Now, for example, say when you look at the concept of God, God is all knowing, all powerful. God is everywhere. God is everything. So according to Friedrich Hegel, and earlier according to Hermes Trismegistus, that the all can only be conscious as itself, but not of itself. Why? Because he who is everything is at the same time nothing, because you can only know what you are if you are in fact in the knowledge of what you are not. So when God negates, because the creative process was a contraction of the one upon itself, that is what Hegel refers to as the absolute. So think of it in Judeo-Christian terms, that God is not knowledgeable of the fact that he is God until God creates something wherein God can see himself in that which he has created. That in order for the one to know it itself, the one must contract to become the two. Just like the very notion and the very concept of, for example, biological sex. Because in one, or should I say in the spirit, the two is expressed as the one, but in the material world, the one expresses itself as the two. That's male and female. This absolute, Hegel held, first puts forth or posits itself in the immediacy of its own inner conscious, and then negates this positing, expressing itself now in the particularity and the determinateness of the factual elements of life and culture, and finally regains itself through the negation of the former negation that had constituted the finite world. Such a dialectical scheme accomplished the self-resolution and the aforementioned problems of logic, of metaphysics, and so on. So there explains Friedrich Hegel's dialectical process. Because what we refer to as our actual existence, we as a society, we run downstream from our ideals. So we have our ideals. Society is downstream from our ideals. And so we live within this, that we have this inner conflict between how we are and how we think that things should be. And within, so the ideal is the synthesis. The society, according to the Hegelian scheme of things, is the antithesis. And the synthesis between the synthesis and the antithesis is embodied in the state. Because the state is the ultimate expression of God's will. Fascist parties, let me go back to fascism for a second. Fascist parties and movements came to power in several countries between 1922 and 1945. The National Fascist Party in Italy, led by Mussolini, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. In 1930, a Catholic priest named Charles E. Coughlin, he began a national radio broadcast of sermons on political and economic subjects. His talks became increasingly undemocratic and anti-Semitic, as did the journal he founded titled Social Justice. After running unsuccessfully for president in 1936, Coughlin became an apologist for Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. In 1942, social justice was banned from the U.S., males for violating the Espionage Act. In the same year, the American Catholic Church ordered Coughlin to stop his broadcast. So you had a man who was an apologist for Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, who had his own broadcast in a journal that he founded called Social Justice. Let me quote the great economist Ludwig von Mises, that when you start talking about societal organization, there are only two ways to skin this cat. We can either have markets or we can have planning. Anytime you start talking about planning, you start to talk about institutions that have a monopoly on force, thus the ability to compel human behavior. And the only entity and instrument that has the ability to do that is, of course, the state. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about fascism or Marxism, we're talking about the state. So when it comes to the American political spectrum, anything or any ideology that places the responsibility of organizing society in the hands of the state, we're talking about something that is on the political left and not the right. Because the state is always in the business of organizing the society, of course, for the purpose of social justice. And look at the 1936 Soviet Constitution that was drafted under the auspice of Joseph Stalin and read it word for word, and it sounds extremely similar to how a lot of you speak today who believe in the gospel of social justice. But Adolf Hitler said the same thing. Adolf Hitler, of course, came to implement his own brand of social justice. What Marx would do and how he would differentiate himself from Hegel in a traditional sense. So dialectical materialism. So this is what Marx came up with. Marx took Hegel's philosophy of dialectics and he turned it into something that was quasi-economic. So he came up with the concept and the notion of dialectical materialism. I'm going to read here directly from the encyclopedia just a clear-cut definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is a philosophical approach to reality derived from the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. For Marx and Engels, materialism meant that the material world, perceptible to the senses, has objective reality independent of mind and spirit. So, the spirit and the mind does not inform the senses or matter or reality. Matter, in a sense, is what, in essence, see, Marx would kind of take everything and capsize it and flip it upside down. Because your consciousness and your perspective on life would be determined by the material world, right? The perceptibility of your own senses. So when we talk about blackness or black consciousness, your attitude or your perception as an individual is first and foremost formed by way of your perception of where you fit in regards to the group. So the group, the black consciousness is what informs your individual consciousness, right? As a person who just so happens to be black. And the collective experience as a black community is, of course, determined by the material world. And what do we mean when we're talking about the material world? We're talking about income. We're talking about geographics. We're talking about all of these numbers and these theory and these statistics that these social theorists put out. This is Marx and Engels. They do not deny the reality of mental or spiritual processes, but affirm that ideas with a capital, no, just lowercase I, I'm sorry, that ideas, I started to get platonic on y'all, that ideas could arise, therefore, only as products and reflections of material conditions. Listen to what Marx is saying. He's saying that ideas can only arise as products and reflections of material conditions. So wait a minute. So when we criticize black folks and when we criticize blackness or anybody, I mean, I talk about black people because I'm black and I am partial to that to a large extent. But it also speaks to the fact that so-called black problems are not just exclusively black problems. Black problems are also America's problems. Let's be clear, because we are Americans and we are here. But Marx says that ideas can only arise as reflections and products of material conditions. So when people talk about, well, here's what black folks need to do in order to get the things out of life that they want, because Marx would take it and invert it. Being the pagan Satanist that he was, he took the truth and inverted it. Because your ideas, or should I say, it is your ideas that in fact inform your material conditions. This is why robbing from the rich and giving to the poor is never going to change the black community. My partner sitting across this table from me sent me a meme or a reel or something not too long ago, showed this development that they put up in Detroit. There was new how it looked wonderful, right? And then it was like fast forward maybe 10 or 15 years later, the place was, you couldn't recognize it, destroyed. Why? Because the people embody the ideas and they carry with them their values. The ghetto isn't the ghetto because it's just the ghetto. The ghetto is the ghetto because the people who inhabit the ghetto embody a ghetto mentality. It's the ideas that create the conditions. The conditions don't create your mind. But that's what Marx believed. This is his example of dialectical materialism. Let me move on. Marx and Engels understood materialism as the opposite of idealism, by which they meant, and any theory, by which, this is what they meant, by which they meant any theory that treats matter as dependent on mind or spirit as capable of existing independently of matter. For them, the materialist and the idealist views were irreconcilably opposed throughout the historical development of philosophy. They adopted a thoroughgoing materialist approach, holding that any attempt to combine or reconcile materialism with idealism would result in confusion and inconsistency. So that's Hegelianism, y'all. And mind you, back then in the heyday of Hegel, you had some Hegelians who were on the right, and those were considered the idealist Hegelians, and you had some Hegelians who were on the left, and those were, of course, the materialists. But the left type of Hegelians, these were at the time considered the young Hegelians. I just want to read a brief description of them. For the most part, indirect disciples of Hegel considered the dialectical as a principle of movement and viewed Hegel's identification of the rational being the ideal, meaning the truth, the real, the rational with the real. The real is the real. Matter, right? The real, the rational is the idea, as a command to modify the culture and political reality that reactionism was merely justifying and to make it rational. So what the young Hegelians who created leftism off the back of the philosophies of Friedrich Hegel, who I have in the past at times defended, because I don't think that Hegel was necessarily malevolent. Karl Marx was malevolent. The left said that, well, we need to take the rational and make it real, even if it means modifying culture and politics. So here's where the political activist element of Hegelianism comes in, because we need to transform what is, or should I say, we need to transform what should be into what is. And remember, what is blocking man from becoming the subject of history is not, and not merely the object, is of course this whole notion that God has everything under control. And this is why leftists have complete and utter contempt for the divine, complete and utter contempt for God, because God makes men too complacent, because the ideology of the Judeo-Christian Bible is one that is too fatalistic, because it makes man resign to the fact that he is in fact in a fallen state. See, the left rejects this, because you can in fact turn the rational into the real only if you are willing to modify culture and politics, because the dialectic is a principle of movement. Goes from here to here. Bring the marginal to the center. Then find another margin and bring the margin to and it just keeps moving until you reach the end of history. I said that Giovanni Gentile was one of the key members of the neo-Hegelian movement, right? So the doctrine of neo-Hegel, I'm just going to briefly describe neo-Hegelianism. It was a movement in Great Britain and in the United States from 1870 to 1920. The name is also sometimes applied to cover other philosophies of the period that were Hegelian in inspiration. For instance, those of Benedetto Croce and Giovanni Gentile. So Marx was inspired by Hegel, and so was the founder of fascism. Don't lose that. Don't lose it. Its exponents sought to give philosophical expression to a widely felt antipathy to the prevailing materialism and utilitarianism, and turned to the writings of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The neo-Hegelians were opposed to materialism and to naturalism in metaphysics, to the analysis of consciousness in terms of sensation and the association of ideas in theory of knowledge, the psychologicism and the formulaism in logic, and to the greatest happiness principle, as well as the doctrine of duty for duty's sake in ethics. So mind you, we keep hearing that fascism is on the right, not the left. Is that correct? Now we're gonna fast forward. So now we done got into a little bit of the philosophical origins of fascism. Did you all know that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat, won 4 terms, pulled us out of the Great Depression, so the story goes, defeated Adolf Hitler, Tojo, Benito Mussolini? Yeah, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm going to read an article written by David Gordon, who is a member of the Mises Institute. I brought up von Mises earlier. He references a book written by a man named Wolfgang Schitzelbusch. The book is entitled The Three New Deals, Reflections on Roosevelt's America, Mussolini's Italy, and Hitler's Germany. Oh man. Critics of Roosevelt's New Deal often liken it to fascism. Roosevelt's numerous defenders dismissed this charge as reactionary propaganda. But was it? Wolfgang writes, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce that last name again, the broad-ranging powers granted to Roosevelt by Congress before that body went into recess. This was 1933. This is Wolfgang talking about Congress of 1933. The broad-ranging powers granted to Roosevelt by Congress before that body went into recess were unprecedented in times of peace. Because we used the Great Depression. Everybody was desperate. So when people are desperate, what do they cling to? They don't rely, they don't put their faith in their fellow man, who's of course made in the image and the likeness of God. They place their image, they place their faith in government when in times of great stress. This is what you had going on back then. So this is how Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to amass immense power. So we talk about Trump and all the other Republicans, all the crazy, the election deniers like Carrie Lake and the conspiracy theorists, Ron DeSantis and a few others, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and Jim Jordan, a couple of the good House members, and maybe a few of the milquetoast guys in the Senate who like to somehow talk like they got some sense. Oh, see, they're the ones who are helping usher in this fascist movement. But no other president in American history, arguably, you can look at Lincoln, and maybe you can look at not Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but Woodrow Wilson, of course, because he had to help prosecute World War I, and there was a lot of American opposition to World War I, and Woodrow Wilson did a lot in terms of shutting down opposition to America's efforts in World War I. And so fast forward, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would do the same thing, but of course, his executive power, his unilateral executive power was unprecedented. We hadn't seen anything like that in American history up until that point. But he is, in fact, a Democrat icon. They love Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal. But his policies at the time were considered to be semi-fascist by way of the people who were criticizing the executive overreach of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time. So how is it that the Republican Party has become the party of fascism, but we haven't seen anything close to the type of fascistic acts committed by a president in this country since Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Through his delegation of powers, Congress had, in effect, temporarily done away with itself as the legislative branch of government. So Congress said, because remember, the legislative body is the body that is most closely connected to the will of the people. Not the president, the legislature. But at the time in 1933, the legislature said, we out. Give it to Roosevelt. In Germany, the only remaining check on the executive was the Supreme Court. He nominated, of course, Hugo Black to the Supreme Court. He was an infamous lawyer that defended the Ku Klux Klan. This was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, remember, famously or infamously at the time, attempted to expand the seats on the court, because he knew that the only thing standing in the way of his fascist agenda was the Supreme Court. So he wanted, while he was in office, to appoint as many justices at the time that he knew would do his bidding. But even at the time, Democrats, who may even in fact have supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were saying, oh, nah, you're going too far now, bruh. His own party had to put him in check because they said we cannot expand the Supreme Court. But that was Roosevelt. In Germany, a similar process allowed Hitler to assume legislative power after the Reichstag burned down in a suspected case of arson on February 28, 1933. January 6th, anybody? Okay. The Nazi press enthusiastically hailed the New Deal measures. America, like the Reich, meaning the Third Reich, had decisively broken with the uninhibited frenzy of market speculation. Oh my God. Didn't I say earlier, planning or markets? Nazis said, don't leave it up to the market. Remember what happened? And I got folks, I'm in Detroit, I got folks who work for the big three. Remember what happened? George Bush even helped, bring that. Well, it was the whole TARP program. Say the big three. Obama came in, took the baton from Bush, continued to extend that. Remember? Certain companies, remember, are just too big to fail. We can't allow them to fail. So the government must bail them out, meaning, i.e., you, the taxpayer, because the uninhibited frenzy of market speculation is what led to the Great Depression. That was the prevailing myth. It wasn't, in fact, market speculation that caused the Great Depression. It was the protectionism that was implemented by Herbert Hoover. About the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, honestly, they would tell you that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in fact, slowed down our recovery because he, of course, interfered with the market. But the socialists in Germany didn't believe in markets, because when you socialize something, keep in mind, whether it's fascism or some other form, fascism is just another form of Hegelianism, which is simply another form of Marxism. Marxists and or communists and fascists, they could talk about how they were fighting each other all they want to. It simply came down to either your allegiance with the race, blood and soil, and the state, or is your allegiance to your class. Simply put, Germany was National Socialism. The Soviet Union was international socialism. And that's where the beef came from. But the reality is that fascists and communists are a lot more similar than they would have you believe. The Nazi Party newspaper, called the People's Party, don't you love that? That was the name of the newspaper, stressed Roosevelt's adoption of National Socialist strains of thought in his economic and social policies, praising the president's style of leadership as being compatible with Hitler's own dictatorial leadership. So the Nazis were praising Roosevelt because his policies were like Hitler's. Hitler himself was never lacking in praise for his American counterpart. He told American ambassador William Dodd, this is Hitler telling Dodd, that he was in accord with the president in the view that the virtue of duty, readiness for sacrifice, and discipline should dominate the entire people. The public will transcends the interests of the individual. This was the German philosophy. This is a quote. This is a slogan of the Nazis. The public will transcends the interests of the individual. Mussolini also went on to say that he found remnants of fascism inside of Roosevelt's administration, the principle that the state no longer leaves the economy to its own devices. Roosevelt never did as much for Hitler, but he did for Mussolini. Now, he would go on to praise Mussolini. This is Roosevelt, speaking of Mussolini. I don't mind telling you in confidence, FDR reminded to a White House correspondent, that I am keeping in fairly close touch with that admirable Italian gentleman. Rux Tuckfeld, a leading advisor to the president, had difficulty containing his enthusiasm for Mussolini's program to modernize Italy, saying that it's the cleanest and most efficient operating piece of social machinery he had ever seen, and it makes him envious. If not for our constitutional system of checks and balances, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would have destroyed this country for good, and he damn near did. John Griffin says, FDR and his foremost cheerleaders at the time specifically espoused open support of the efficiency of Mussolini and Hitler and welcomed fascism. Roosevelt himself once called Mussolini admirable. Mussolini returned the compliment with adulatory praise, writing of Roosevelt's many reforms, reminiscent of fascism in the principle that the state no longer leaves the economy to its own devices. I just cleared that. NAACP founder, W.E.B. Du Bois, Du Bois, for those Francophiles out there, viewed the Nazi rise positively. You didn't know this, did you? Saying that Hitler's dictatorship had been absolutely necessary to get the state in order. In 1937, Du Bois stated, there is today, in some respects, more democracy in Germany than there had been in past years. I myself, and this is going off memory, read in Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Race, that it was W.E.B. Du Bois who once referred to the Third Reich as the greatest example of democracy in the Western world. This is W.E.B. Du Bois speaking about Hitler. Now, you can say, well, man, this was before 1939, right? The invasion of Warsaw, Poland. So they all called themselves progressives, but they were economic socialists, and they believed in the philosophy of biological determinism. We call that eugenics today. The man who was a close friend and somewhat of a confidant, I dare say, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a man by the name of Madison Grant, who heavily influenced, of course, Adolf Hitler. I'm trying to remember the book that Madison Grant wrote that Adolf Hitler, I think he described it in his own words as being his own personal Bible when it came to his attitudes towards race. But they were all, of course, early 20th century progressives. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, would go on to renounce his American citizenship and openly admit his membership to the Communist Party sometime during the 1960s. The New York Times reporter Ann O'Hare McCormick wrote fawningly in the aftermath of Roosevelt's inauguration that Washington, D.C., strangely reminiscent of Rome in the first weeks after the March of the Black Shirts, of Moscow at the beginning of the 5-year plan. America today literally asks for orders. So this writer at the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inauguration is saying that it looks like those who are in support of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they look eerily similar to Mussolini's black shirts. Fascism was the wave of the future. Are you all familiar with who the Bull Moose is? Y'all heard of the Bull Moose? Y'all know who the Bull Moose is? The Bull Moose is one of 4 men on Mount Rushmore. That's Teddy. That's Franklin's cousin, right? Wasn't Franklin and Teddy, wasn't they cousins? Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt was once a Republican. But he broke away from the Republican Party and started his own faction called the Bull Moose Party, formerly known as the Progressive Party. But wait a minute, why? You see, I'm reading, U.S. descendant political faction that dominated former President Teddy Roosevelt as his candidate in the presidential election of 1912. So what they're saying is the Bull Moose Party, that was that was Theodore Roosevelt's party when he ran for office in 1912. The formal name and general objectives of the party were revived 12 years later, opposing, get this, the entrenched conservatism of the regular Republican Party, which was at the time controlled by William H. Taft. A National Republican Progressive League was organized in 1911. So what you had at the time was this split between conservative Republicans and the progressive wing of the Republican Party. What ended up happening was the William Taft-led faction of the Republican Party said, we don't want this progressive. Theodore Roosevelt took the ideology of progressivism and formed his own party. And it was due to the split that occurred as a result of the progressive wing of the Republican Party leaving the Republican Party. The Democrat progressive Woodrow Wilson would, of course, come to power after Theodore Roosevelt. So it was the Republican Party that is rejecting progressivism today, at least the better elements of it. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1910 that gave an espousal of active federal intervention to promote social justice and economic welfare of the underprivileged. Its precepts were strongly influenced by Herbert Crawley's The Promise of American Life, written in 1910. Roosevelt used the phrase new nationalism in a 1910 speech in which he attempted to reconcile the liberal and progressive wings of the Republican Party. But the conservative wing of the Republican Party won out, and of course, a couple of years later, we saw one of the greatest presidents in American history who doesn't get cited enough, and that is, of course, Calvin Coolidge. So, new nationalism is about reconciling the liberal and conservative wings of the Republican Party, and it was about implementing social justice and the economic welfare of the underprivileged. So this was Teddy Roosevelt believed in implementing all of these programs to help the underprivileged, which does nothing, of course, but keep them poor. And what ended up happening later on is that his cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would come about just 20 or so years later and finish what Theodore Roosevelt had started. So when they say that fascism is a far-right authoritarian movement, you ask them, who is Giovanni Gentile? And see what they say. Who is Friedrich Hegel? And see what they say. What is the Hegelian dialectic? And see what they say. What is the difference between Gentile and Marx? And see what they say. Single source, same seed. Same seed. Two so-called opposing factions, merely illusory. Same seed. By their fruits you shall know them. Totalitarianism is totalitarianism no matter how you slice it. You either let the people govern themselves or you let the state make all of the decisions. Both communism and fascism both posit or both espouse the same belief, and that is the state is better suited when it comes to making decisions than the individual. Fascism is on the left. And I'm out.